Okay, everybody. It's 101, so I don't want to, waste your time, but I got to get you this in-out code because I know that's what you want. So grab your CEU sheet. The first in-out code is 11. I feel like I said that one before. Double 11s. Oh no, it was 22. But I said double 11s. Okay, 11, not 22, 11. Don't write down the wrong one. Okay. Hopefully you all know that you are in understanding the rules and regulations behind the Self-Directed Services Technical Guidance. If you are not in the right place, now is your last chance to escape. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We are trying to help people kind of understand the importance of the guidance, which is our best practice manual, and how it is very much centered and supported by policy and federal requirements. So, as you can see, true self-determination, self-directed services is really a partnership. The goal is really to help people we support to live meaningful lives in their homes and communities. And really, like I said, this guidance is here to support that. So we really want to make sure that people have the tools and resources they need to really give people the best chance at a successful arrangement. Is there anybody for some reason who is kind of a very beginning stage, in the beginning stages of understanding self-direction or arrangements that support self-determination? I have one, two. Okay, cool. All right, so real fast, Cap, since we have a minority. So self-directed services was formerly known as self-determination. And what it does is allows people, it's an opportunity for all people in Michigan who receive behavioral health supports to be able to drive and control their services that they receive. So basically, in Michigan, we have what's called both employer authority and budget authority. And that means that an individual can choose to hire the people they want, as Erica talked about this morning, to come into their house and provide certain services. And they can use the dollars that would have typically been spent on them in a traditional service model to be able to purchase whatever it is that they need to support the goals of their plan. So it really is a higher step, I guess, beyond person-centered planning to really take real control of the services that the person needs and desires and be able to direct and control them in a more impactful way. Okay. So, I keep double clicking somehow. Apologies. So, an overview for this document. So we have the guidance language in white. There's green language that's kind of usually a summary of what's said and not a direct quote, just so you're very clear on what you're looking at. And then anything that's from the self-directed services technical requirement, which is our policy, or federal regulations, contractual language, et cetera, is in yellow. So you're gonna see that our policy is pretty short. I think there's 5 pages without definitions, and the guidance is about 60 pages. So while we have kind of an overview of like, this is what must be done in that policy, there's a lot of detail that goes into each of those things. So you're gonna see where all of that language can be found through this presentation. So the SD policy and practice guidelines have been in contracts since at least early 2000s. So this is not new, like we didn't just make it up. This has been going on for a long time. There have been some new laws and extra things that have happened since that inception that have kind of changed some things, but for the most part, this is kind of the way that it has been intended to be directed from its inception. So in 2019, we did a waiver renewal, and where you find a lot of the authority for things about self-direction and arrangements that support self-determination is actually in our waiver language. So in 2019, we expanded the waivers so that self-directed services or self-determination was available to all populations. And there's also, when we switch to the 1915I, it's also available to the 1950I. So every single person who receives specialty mental health services is able to choose a self-directed option. There was also some vague language in policy that, because it was vague, we changed to basically say that it used to be that the PIHPs had the option to choose whether or not children could self-direct, the families, children could self-direct their services. But that information wasn't getting down to the CMHs quite as readily as it would be so that people could actually do this. So we just kind of opened it up to make sure that everybody gets the same opportunity. So the only limitation to what I said that everybody gets this is based on the settings. So as you can see at the bottom of the slide, in the section of every waiver,
It's not advancing.
oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. There you go, thank you. Please feel free to wave again because I'm working off 2 screens here. Someday I will be very good at it, but. Now you can see at the bottom of the slide that in Michigan, we have only identified that people that live in their own home or their family home can self-direct. So that leaves out, residential settings and foster care homes. So at that time, that's really the only caveat, I guess, to that everybody being able to receive self-directed services. So this is kind of the main pages of that policy that's going to be in yellow. So I just wanted to give you kind of an overview. This is what it looks like. And really, these are the pages that we're talking about throughout this presentation. So 3 pages compared to all the guidance. It's kind of like the meat, right? Nope, I did it again. Okay, so first thing that you really have to understand about anything about self-direction is that it's all about person-centered planning. It is and always has been and probably always will be that all self-directed budgets and everything you're doing through self-directed services happens through the person-centered planning process. So any developing of that budget, how people decide to manage, like what model they're going to use, what financial management service provider, formerly known as fiscal intermediary, is going to be in that plan. They're going to develop a backup plan. There should be a spending plan. So you develop a budget not just for the sake of having a budget, but they're also supposed to kind of decide what it is, how they're going to use those dollars to meet the goals of their plan. So you really need to be, having somebody to help with that person-centered planning process that's going to be able to think about how can we use this money creatively to do something, in the person, that the person wants to do in their best interest to meeting their goals of their plan. And then, of course, we're determining that medical necessity and really kind of that either historically the amount of dollars that were used in the year before or the estimated cost of service is really going to give you kind of that budget cap. And those things are all done through that person-centered planning process. So as you can see in the policy on page 2, number 12, it says that all person-centered planning processes, service delivery and budget planning will support the individuals to make decisions about and control their own lives, etc. So, and I highlighted in this little picture that the PIHP must meet these following requirements. So anything you're seeing in that language that has a page number and then the parentheses with a number, that's a requirement. So there's 15 of those. And so when it starts, it'll start to say page 3, and then it starts at 1 and 2. Then we're talking about some of the key elements. But otherwise, we're mainly talking about these requirements. Can you give me, in what way?
So you're saying in this, that are the requirements in the person-centered planning, or are you talking about?
Oh, this picture is,
I can't see it there, so I'm sorry.
oh, that's okay. Is it blurry to you guys? Or just me? Oh, can we fix that? I thought it was my eyes were old, so we're in the same boat. Yeah, so in the little picture in the yellow box, this is coming out of that policy. So this, at the title, it says self-directed services technical requirements. So we're talking about, thank you. We're talking specifically about the requirements that are listed in the self-directed services technical requirement, which we also refer to as the policy. Thank you for your question and clarification. Oh, okay. So in the guidelines, it says the following requirements must be written into the individual plan of service. And then it goes into what services will be directed, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the requirements, it says the IPOS must include all of the components as described below. This is actually out of the person-centered planning policy. So letter H of those requirements of the components, it says the services which the person chooses to obtain through arrangements that support self-determination. And if you care to look it up later, it's on page 9, bullet H. So one of the keys to making sure that these arrangements are successful is making sure that the person who in these arrangements is usually the employer of record, if they're directly hiring people, they really need to be educated and have information and support to be able to direct their arrangement successfully. And this is repeated many, many, many times throughout the guidance and the policy. Because it is so vital, and if you are someone who is worried about mistakes and fraud or waste, this is really the place to prevent that. Making sure that people really understand what they're doing and what they're getting into is really key to making sure. For those of you who are here for Erica's talk, she talked about, I don't live without these services, so I'm not going to do anything to mess them up. So if people really understand what it is they're responsible for, they're probably not going to purposefully try to damage that relationship because it is so vital to their lives. So in general, the person needs to understand how this option works, what their duties are, and basically, there's a language in CMS that talks about them being trained as a support broker. So basically, they need to understand the same ideas of a broker. And brokers might be new to a lot of people, but really, it's that information assistance part. If you look at the waiver language, it talks about information and assistance being supplied by either a supports coordinator, an assistant supports coordinator, a support broker, and I believe there's like the independent supports coordinator, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be a number of people. And what has happened is we kind of put all of these things onto the support coordinator or case manager, which we already know that they have a lot of things on their plate. And so sometimes this very vital piece kind of gets lost because that information assistance can't be done as thoroughly. And so those brokers can be utilized specifically for that education piece and to support that person. So it's kind of taking that off the support coordinator or case manager's plate. So if the person thinks they have the knowledge and training, they understand how to be that employer, et cetera, then they can be considered trained as a support broker. But if they don't have that information, then they need to actually get trained on that. And so here is the, no, maybe. Oh my goodness. That was the slide I was just talking about. I'm so sorry. If you guys see anything that doesn't make sense, wave at me. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you got to look at that. So this is a picture of, in the guidance, where we're talking about information assistance. So we're saying that the PHP CMH must provide the support of being an employer, managing employees, making sure they understand their Medicaid documentation expectations, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is going to apply to them if they're that employer, because they have to do the same things as everybody else who employs people, the roles and responsibilities of that CMH, the fiscal intermediary or the financial management service provider, and the individual and that budget management. And so this is supported in a couple different places. So first, in the page 3, which is then getting into the key elements in the policy, it says the PHP and the CMH will provide ongoing support and assistance to individuals managing and controlling the supports they are directing. Then there's language in the waivers, and this is a requirement from CMS that everybody have information and support to make this work. And also in the HCBS final rule, you have to have voluntary training on how to select, manage, and dismiss providers of state plan HCBS. So there's quite a few regs that go behind the language there. So again, some more information and assistance. Both the individual and the PHP CMH have roles and responsibilities in supporting the successful implementation of self-directed service arrangements. In both number 10 and 14, it supports this again, and this is why we're kind of spending a lot of time on this, because it is so vital to making sure that these arrangements work. People have to be fully informed about how these things work, all the possible ways that they can control and manage their budgets. They need to have information and outreach materials that can help them in an accessible format, so that no matter who you are, if you would like to choose this option, you have the materials and information to support it successfully. And then we want to make sure that the people who are doing the education also are educated. So in the guidance, it just talks about the PHP CMH being proactive and knowledgeable and up to date in self-directed service arrangements, including all the applicable laws. And then in the policy, number 11 and 12, it talks about providing that education and training to ensure a common understanding through all of its networks. So those of you that have been around for a while, you know that SD is more than just maybe that support coordinator, case manager, or a SD coordinator. That sometimes we get even like contracts and finance and all kinds of people involved to make sure that these arrangements run smoothly. There needs to be people that you can contact at the CMH level, and that FMS provider, there has to be kind of a designated person so that everybody stays in communication. So making sure that everybody understands how this all works is really vital to making the arrangement successful. Moving on to provider choice. So provider choice is, a mainstay in general of behavioral health services, but it's especially important and in an expanded way in these arrangements. So you're probably already hopefully helping people to understand their choices of provider through Medicaid. And in these instances, we shouldn't be limiting anybody's choice. Part of the bonus, I guess, of doing a self-directed arrangement is that the person doesn't have to stay with contracted providers. If they want to hire somebody outside of that network, then they can do so. So some people ask me about where it says that people can choose their own providers. So I made a nice list. There's basically everywhere, I kind of feel like it is, but it was in the old SD policy even. It's not a new thing. And so in the current policy, number 6 is that self-directed services does not reduce the PIHP's responsibility to individuals receiving services, nor negate its responsibility to assist individuals in finding providers for services. And this does apply in those direct hire arrangements. So if someone's having difficulty, like are we going back to the drawing board and saying, what's your backup plan? What are we gonna do to make sure that your services and supports are covered? And if something happens and the arrangement needs to be terminated for some reason, that doesn't mean that magically the person just doesn't get any supports anymore. There has to be a plan to switch them back to a traditional model if necessary. So there's always that responsibility at the PIHP level. This is a lot of words. So provider qualifications. So in self-directed services, the state gets to set the qualifications for the providers. These are set in the code chart. These were always set in the code chart, and the old SD policy said the same thing. There was a difference because that policy was written before the FLSA rules for co-employment went into effect, unfortunately just before. And so some of those rules in the SD policy prior to this one had talked about, the PIHPs being able to set qualifications above what's in the code chart. But if a staff is a qualified Medicaid provider and they've done the things necessary for credentialing to be that Medicaid provider, then they're qualified to be that provider. So the current policy says employer authority, and this is right at the top. Employer authority means the individual recruits, hires, supervisors, directs, and fires the support staff. And then there are things supporting this in the guidance. And one of the things that I think CMHs and PHPs seem to misunderstand is that just because the person is able to kind of hire who they want, it doesn't mean that the CMH doesn't have any power or control in these situations. So the CMH is the payer, right? So if somebody is trying to hire somebody that doesn't meet Medicaid qualifications, for example, or there's something kind of going sideways with the arrangement, then they're not so, you don't want to tell people who they can and can't hire, because then you're kind of looking at a joint employer rule. But you can say, you can hire this person, but we aren't able to fund it because it's not meeting those Medicaid standards. So that's kind of where you have that control over what's happening. So if there's a situation that you're getting into, sometimes there's a recipient rights violation, maybe, for example, that the credentialing doesn't necessarily catch. So you can look at that and say, you know, this is too egregious. We can't take the risk of you hiring this person. So we're not going to be able to fund it. So some of the things in the guide for that oversight that you'll find is, you know, it talks about if, you know, you've tried everything to get people to, the employees aren't doing their trainings, they're not following documentation guidelines, et cetera, and you've trained and gone in and talked to the employer and said, if this doesn't work, we're gonna have to suspend your employees, and nothing's happening, then the CMH, you know, has that authority to terminate the employee's Medicaid provider agreement. And that way, you know, that person won't be eligible to work anymore. The other thing that they have in that same part of the guidance is really talking about, you know, the role of the CMH to really support the person as that employer and provide that oversight. So you're monitoring health and safety, you know, and that proper use of Medicaid funds. So eliminating or terminating the arrangement is always done in that terms of removing that source of funding. So I find those to be helpful and useful snippets in situations where, you know, you feel like things have gotten a little bit sticky and you feel like you're wondering where to turn. And the agreements that people sign when they start these arrangements are really your tools to really make sure that the CMH is protected. So, you know, if somebody, I don't know, wants to hire a brother and there's some concerns about whatever, I don't know, maybe he has like a light larceny or some crime that, you know, the person, it meets the background check, but, you know, you're worried about the caliber of this person. You can use the SD agreement to mitigate whatever that risk is, that you feel like this could be a problem, the brother's gonna take advantage of you, whatever. The person really should be making that decision that it's in their best interest to hire the person. And, you know, if there's still qualms about that and you've talked through it, then you work through that agreement. And it is an agreement, so the person's agreeing, like, I'm not gonna let my brother take advantage of me in X way. And then whatever kind of mitigation, so if X happens, then we will do Y, you know, whatever. So use those documents to really try and, you know, kind of nip those things in the bud before they become a problem. I find that a lot of people aren't using those agreements as well as they could. The agreements that are in the end of the guidance are templates. So they are supposed to be individualized for each person. So this is really kind of if you're worried about anything, really, that's your place to put those safeguards. Starting to see what Erica was saying about the button. It's getting harder and harder. Okay, so more about oversight. So just again, a summary of some of the stuff in the guidance. The CMH case holder is making sure that the training on the IPOS is happening just like anybody else, right? That there's a staffing backup plan. So if somebody doesn't show up for work for whatever reason, like what's happening? Is mom stepping in? Are we calling a agency with choice? Like what's gonna happen? There always has to be a backup plan. The employer of record needs to understand what those Medicaid documentation requirements are, and they are responsible for then making sure that their employees are writing up documentation per those standards. So if you've got documentation issues, you're going to the employer of record saying, hey, we have some problems, what are you gonna do? I suggest you talk to your employees in X way, right? Because if this keeps happening, then we're not gonna be able to pay claims, et cetera, right? And then obviously, as with everything, you know, that services are being provided as indicated to support the person's goals. So then on number 15 on page 3, it says the PHP with the CMH will provide ongoing support and assistance to individuals managing and controlling the supports they are directing. And then there's a little blurb about the Offices of Recipient Rights. This is in both the guidance and the policy. And it literally says the Office of Recipient Rights has investigative authority for specialty mental health services and supports, including self-directed supports and services. And there's a oversight section in the guidance, so that's kind of just a summary of that whole page. Okay, now we're going into the good stuff. So the budget, yay. So in the guide, we have language that says the PHP CMH must establish a transparent process for the budget development and educate each individual on the process prior to engaging in budget development. So again, number 15, about that providing ongoing support. Examples are training, training on documentation, service delivery, the role of the employer, the role of the employee in budgeting. And then number 10, that people will be fully informed about the meaning of self-directed services and all models and possible ways to control, manage, and account for their individual budget. So you really want to make sure that your process is transparent. So really the how of budget authority. We're really trying to, budget authority has been kind of limited, and really that, what we were talking about, being able to purchase things with the dollars shouldn't be limited to just Medicaid, because once you put those dollars into a budget, we're really talking about a lump sum of money that person is then in charge of being able to spend responsibly, right? So that's why you work with your FMS provider to make sure that you're getting regular reports about how people are spending their budget, and if they're overspending or underspending, if it's gonna help prevent any kind of, overage or underage of the budget at the end of the year, and catch problems before they become too big to fix. So we really wanna make sure that whatever that person is responsible for with that budget, that they really understand what's going on. And if they need more support with that understanding, make sure you give that to them. So this is where we get into so you look at the estimated cost of services. Most people have this in their EMR. So there's something at the end that it's either a table, or some people just have a line that says the estimated cost of services for your plan is $36,712 or whatever it says. So this is not, a mystery where it is. It's something that's been in the contract for a while. There's a estimated cost of service technical advisory that's a contract attachment. So you take the total of what was spent on the person last year, and if last year they weren't self-directing and now they are, you take the budget, that's kind of the cap of their budget, and they really build up from the person-centered planning process, talking about I have these dollars now, I would like to purchase X with them, and really kind of building that budget from the ground up. And they might meet the top, and they might not. So it's kind of all up to how that person wants to meet their goals. So the policy that reflects this is self-directed services and supports are set up through the person-centered planning process, from which an IPOS is and medically necessary services are developed. So that's really kind of where the crux of that comes from. So, and this gets into kind of establishing the cap. So in order to establish that maximum amount for the budget, The service costs should not be less than the contracted provider rate for the same service with the same level of need for that individual. And then this is reflected in the waiver language. So the waiver language says, and this is kind of our, I didn't get the slide, thank you. You can yell at me. Appropriate slide, okay. In the waiver language, it talks about the amount of the individual budget is determined by costing out the services and supports in the plan of service after the plan of service meets the participant needs and goals and has been developed. And the process involves costing out the services and supports using the rates for the chosen providers by the participant and the number of hours authorized in the IPOS. So this has, again, been in language for a very, very long time. The guidance was just there to emphasize that. Yes. Okay, so budget authority or budget flexibility is, again, one of those old standbys. So in the guidance, it talks about the individual may adjust the CMHP authorized funds to accomplish the goals of their plan. This could include moving funds between lines. So, and then in the policy, it talks about that the budget needs to be flexible, accessible, and portable. So flexible means flexible spending, individual controlled use of dollars, and the amount of services identified in the plan within a fixed budget. So the whole idea of this is that just like you or I, we have our income budget and something weird happens and we gotta move money, right? We gotta spend, our car broke down, weren't planning on that. We're not, I don't know, going to eat or going out to eat anymore for the rest of the month. We're gonna, right? So you just move the money to this line. We're gonna pay for this instead of this. So it's the same idea, right? So it's not new, it's just being able to reallocate those funds. And then the bottom one is about, it's from the waiver language again. And this picture is showing the waiver language where it gives the authority. This is in the HAB waiver, the children's waiver specifically. So yes, across the board, this is not technically in language for everybody. So you do want to be waiver specific with this. But the idea of being able to use dollars flexibly, no matter what waiver you're on, will always be in budget authority, no matter what population, whatever you're working with. It's just that, so taking dollars from a similar service, so like if you had CLS and respite, for example, you wanted to move those dollars and say, I'm gonna use less respite and more CLS or vice versa, that would just be in the HAB waiver and children's waiver. Make sense? Okay. Go ahead.
Just a quick question, under the flexible with the yellow,
Yes.
changes to the budget should not require a change to the IPOS unless services are terminated or increased. What?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Oh, sure, we're recording. Why, sure I can. So, in the yellow where it says the flexible part about changes to the budget should not require a change to the IPOS unless services are terminated or increased. In a meeting I was in earlier this week, I think you were on it too, Monday, we had a long conversation about when the rate changes, having to have another planning meeting to address the rate change. Is that in conflict to this?
The language is basically talking about that just because there's a change, so we get into, like an authorization.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
We change it from, I don't know, 25 hours to 20 hours or whatever, right? So just because it's really talking about this moving this money. Mm-hmm. So the budget itself is not changing. And so that move should not require a change to the plan of service because that's already
So this is different than a
Yeah.
rate change?
Yes.
Which would require a planning meeting to be held to change the, like we talked about the pass-through money, the direct care wage pass-through money, changing a wage from $324 a unit to $326 a unit. And earlier this week in the meeting, the conversation was we would have to have a planning meeting. But to move the money throughout the budget with already approved services, I don't need a meeting. But to change a rate because of a wage pass-through, I do need to have a meeting.
I think in that meeting, at least I thought we were talking about rate changes like to services, which I was confused because I was like, that would probably mean a new plan anyway. So,
Right, and that's, I
But-
guess, where the question is. I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So if I have CLS and out-of-home non-vote, for example, in my budget, and I have this is a horrible example, support employment CLS, and I got a new job and I need more coaching on the job site and less support in my home now, I could technically move money from the CLS line to the supported employment line and be
Correct.
okay.
yes,
Okay, and in the other scenario, if everything's gonna stay the same, but now the money that's available to me in my budget changes by 24 cents a unit. So service intensity stays the same. Rate and wage may change. Is that different?
well, then the budget would need to be adjusted.
That's why I'm asking, because the
So-
budget is changing.
Yeah,
Right, but
But-
if I move the money, it's not considered a change in the budget because it's already approved funds.
yeah,
I'm just moving on service lines.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for all that, sorry. Well, sure. Yeah, and, yes, and from an auditing standpoint, if I would change CLS and supported employment that way, I'd have to do a notice to advance notice the fact I've got an already authorized service that I'm reducing now. Yeah. Absolutely. You would have the meeting anyways, right? I just
Well-
wanted to make sure because it said that.
And to that, there's a fun little part of Medicaid manual that says if somebody is making a change like that to their plan because they have decided to make that change, they can just put that in writing and they don't need an adverse benefit determination. So. I'll get back to you. It's early, that's all I remember. Ooh, you guys like that one. Thought maybe you guys were asleep for a while. Okay. I can tell you, your head just exploded, so do you need a break? Okay. All right, ready? Okay, so in the guidance, we say the budget must be authorized for the same time frame as the plan. This is kind of, I think, common sense because if you're authorizing it for a different time frame, the person doesn't actually have control over the budget, right? So that's in there. Then the policy supports that because it says self-directed services and supports are set up using a person-centered planning process from which an IPOS is developed, right? And from that, the budget is developed. So if those processes are crossing at two different times, then we're not following policy, right? Okay. So now we're getting into kind of the things that the CMH can control in that budget. So really, once the budget is developed and the arrangement starts, like the CMH is kind of going into oversight mode, just as they would with any kind of implementation of services in general, right? And the budget really should be between the person and the FMS. They're kind of talking about, I want to move, these line items to this line item. I want to give this worker a raise because they're amazing, whatever the thing is, right? And so the CMH is kind of really staying out of that like employer business at that point. But they do have some controls. So they are allowed to establish a training rate. So if people are going to go into the CMH, for example, to receive some kind of training, they can establish whatever that rate of pay will be. They will require workman's comp. They establish the maximum amount of the budget cap that we talked about earlier. They're still having like that budget oversight again with the person and the FMS provider to make sure that nobody's blowing the budget early, because that would be bad. And they are authorizing that budget again for the same time frame as the plan of service. So there's a bunch of financial management services, tech stuff that we'll get into in the next slide, but this comes out of budget authority. So on page 3, and that's what I was talking about, we're getting into those key elements of the policy. Number 2, budget authority is being able to control an individual budget, and it's core to self-directed services because it's projected amount of public mental health funds. It's, you know, in the context of that medical necessity, and there's supposed to be a spending plan that is really in the authority of the person. So again, CMH makes the cap, the person is really in control of how the dollars are spent. And then it gets into the accessible portable, so just threw that in there. So then some of the other controls that I talked about, you know, in the FMS Tech Guide, and this is in the guidance, they're the ones who track and monitor that budget expenditure, looking for those potential over and underage. They're minimally providing that monthly budget report. They talk to that assigned contact we talked about earlier at the CMH to make sure that everybody's on the same page and they know what's going on. And then contact that CMH if there's ever an expenditure that's over 10% of the budget. Kind of like every budget is broken down kind of into those 12 months usually to make the monthly budget report. So if they see a kind of red flag that they're contacting, so sorry. Thank you. I need an assistant, I think. Oh. So without these things in place, people who are directly hiring workers are going to have a really hard time maintaining their budget. So these are the supports that we really need to help people make sure that they're within the boundaries of what they're supposed to be doing. And it's a team process, so. Okay, here we go, yes. Okay, so the budget, I'm kind of going, or not the budget, the guidance, I'm kind of going through it in order. If for some reason one of you has memorized it, you'll notice. So now we get to the direct employment model part. So in the guidance, it says the CMH must provide needed support and training to the individual in areas related to functioning as an employer. In the policy, it says, again, the PHP and CMH will provide ongoing support and assistance to individuals managing and controlling the supports they are directing, right? So we give people these options, but we don't expect them to do it alone. We have the people that are trained and they should understand the roles and responsibilities, and then we provide the support to make sure that they can continue to be successful. Then payroll decisions are handled between the employer and the FMS, like I had said earlier, and this is kind of just basic laws of employment, and really if you look at any provider in the Medicaid manual, it's kind of the same thing. They're gonna go to their employer for, you know, any payroll decisions or anything that's happening there. So when people hire people in the direct employment model, like we've said, it's really a partnership between the individual, the CMH, the FMS, and really centered with that individual making the ultimate decisions and choices. The CMH must support a transparent system to ensure timely onboarding of all employees and should not be establishing policies that are an unnecessary barrier to timely hiring of employees. So again, I like 15 apparently, it's a good one. The PIHP and CMH will provide ongoing support and assistance to individuals managing and controlling the supports they are directing. So really, it's imperative to make sure that the person is supported to do this because it's hard enough to hire people in general. But then if there are all kinds of barriers thrown up by the CMH to getting people onboarded and started, it makes it really difficult to keep people hired, or if they have to wait for a paycheck for, I don't know, 2 weeks longer than they thought they were. I don't know about any of you, but if I don't get paid for work I did, I'm probably not staying around. So having extra barriers that aren't necessary is jeopardizing these arrangements. So then we get into timesheets and documentation. In the guidance, it says the timesheet must include the employee providing the service, the type of service, the time the service started and ended, the date, and the employee and employer signature, general Medicaid billing requirements, and the documented or the required documentation that corresponds to those timesheets must meet Medicaid documentation standards. So in the policy it says all Medicaid services and support terms apply. Hopefully that's not shocking to anybody. All right. So then we talk about, again, the partnership between the person, the employer of record, the CMH and the FMS. So when there are some issues, for example, the worker does not meet provider qualifications, there's concerns related to acceptable documentation, the employer of record is not following any of the Medicaid requirements, the documentation is inconsistent with timesheets, there's incomplete trainings, there's issues with potential fraud, waste, and abuse. These are things that need to be worked out together. And so the policy talks about all Medicaid services and support terms apply. So we want to make sure that people they understand their roles and responsibilities and that they're able to follow those. So we're not saying just because this person is control of this budget and they can spend it how they like, that there aren't any rules and responsibilities around that. And that is all I thought I would have time for. So, what questions do you have for me?
In your trainings, when you have a self-determination arrangement where they're passing medications, what does the state think as far as the staff that are there not having medication administration training?
Ooh, thank you for asking this. So the staff qualifications, like I said, are the bare minimum to get that provider up and running. If a person, according to the mental health code, is not able to administer their own medications, the staff are required to have medication training. So that is a training that the CMH can say they have to have. However, it is not a training that they can say, you are not qualified to be a staff and we are not going to pay you. Yes. So
So it's required to pass the meds, so you could have someone working that doesn't pass meds, is what you're saying?
Yes.
So if anyone who passes the meds, we would put that in the plan of service and say, you have to be medication administration trained in order to pass the meds. And if
Exactly.
anyone else passes the meds that's not, then that would be a violation of the standard.
Correct.
Okay.
You could also work that into the SD agreement if that person cannot pass their own meds, that they will agree to make sure that people have that training. So, and that's really the rules around training in general, is anything above and beyond that staff qualifications. If there's something that the CMH or PHP feels is valuable, they're absolutely allowed to encourage the person, the employer, to have those trainings done. But it's just not something that you can mandate and take away somebody's pay because of they don't have those requirements done. Yes. Oh, I think you need a microphone. Hold on, sorry.
I'm coming.
It's just kind of a follow-up to that question. Does it mandate who and what training they have to have in order to be considered medication pass training? Because I'll use, for example, I've been through the training many times, but you have individuals that we serve that have seizure disorders. And there's a couple different routes and medications you can give for that, and that training doesn't teach that at all. So in particular, rectal diastat and nasolam. So is it clear that if the family has been determined a trainer by like the doctor prescribing the medication, can the family train on route, amount, how to read the bottle, and document that as they have trained the staff in the manner that has been taught to them by the physician?
I think that that would be, especially if that employer record feels that it's important to have that training above and beyond medication training, that they should absolutely say, this is a training I would like additional to the staff requirements. And I cannot speak for the CMHs, but I would hope that they would approve that, especially if you have the doctor signing off that this, that the family members or whoever is going to be able to train on this, and that would be acceptable. But you have to check with the CMH. I don't believe that there's anything that would prevent that from happening. And especially as the employer of record, it's your employees, so you train them how you would like. There's a question back there.
On the training piece, because we're working through this right now. So if I am a contracted provider in our region, we have a training grid that indicates the services that an aid level of care, let's say CLS, has to complete. And if I am directly hiring an aid level of care, are you saying that the same trainings don't apply, so a person in a self-directed arrangements would have less training than a contracted provider would have? And that's okay with the state and auditors?
The required trainings for a staff to be qualified to provide services.
Oh, I know what our training grid, I know what you're saying. I'm asking just logistically. Logistically, it's okay.
So, yes.
Thank you.
Those employees are not the CMH's employees.
I understand that.
So,
I'm just asking out loud, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. When talking about the person being able to get services outside of a contracted agreement, so is it an all or nothing? So just an example, we provide speech and occupational therapy, but are not contracted with the CMH to provide PT. So could that person get PT from a self-directed and pay us directly outside of CMH? Or does it have to be all three services on a self-directed plan?
No, so what, in that example, you would do what's called, and I didn't get through we did direct hire, and then there's purchase of service, and there's agency with choice or agency-supported self-determination. So those three models, what you're talking about is doing a purchase of service. So the person can kind of directly contract with that PT in this example. They have to accept the Medicaid rate, right? And then it's a little bit different than a direct hire because obviously that employer of record is not going to supervise a physical therapist. They don't have that training, right? But they will be able to pay that PT through their budget. Any other questions? And I forgot my beautiful slide. I was supposed to co-present this with my colleague Marie Eagle. So if at any time you have any questions for either of us, these are our emails. And the out code is 74. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, we have a help desk that you can submit questions to, and we keep those answers online for people to reference whenever they feel like it. So, thank you.